So this film is related to a forthcoming book of mine titled New England's Roadside Ecology. It was sparked by the Roadside Geology series. Many states have a roadside geology book that just alerts people to places they can pull over on the side of a road to look at an interesting rock outcropping or maybe see a nice view of a meandering river or something geological. And I thought, well, how about if we did something on ecology, that you stop at the side of the road at a trailhead parking lot that leads you on a trail through one of our exemplary natural communities in ecosystems in New England. So that's what sparked this book. It covers about 30 different sites throughout New England, including alpine tundra sites, sand dunes, bogs, swamps, marshes, a lot of different forest types, including a lot of stands that have old growth trees, like this yellow birch right here. So here we have mountain laurel. It's one of our two large evergreen shrubs in this portion of New England. So the mountain laurel and the other one is the rhododendron. They both keep their leaves throughout the year, and there's a liability to that in that in sites that get really cold, the moisture in these leaves is not frozen. It stays in liquid state, but it can sublimate out because when it's really cold, the air is so dry in terms of relative humidity that the air can be sucked out. So these plants around here are pretty much restricted to warmer sites where generally the temperature will not get down below about -10 degrees. If it starts getting colder than that, the leaves dry out and they die. So the advantage is by having these evergreen leaves is they can photosynthesize throughout the year. And if their roots are not icebound, they can even photosynthesize in temperatures down to about 21 degrees Fahrenheit. However, the bulk of their photosynthesis is probably happening in the spring and the fall when the canopy leaves come down. And so they're actually doing a lot more photosynthesis than any of our other understory forest shrubs here in New England. And that gives them the ability, both the laurel and the rhododendron, to do something else that our other shrubs can't do. They can produce an opulent bloom. Now, this is not a very dramatic bloom for mountain laurel, and that's because we're sort of in amongst some hemlocks. There's not as much light here as there would be if we were just in a hardwood forest. On a good bloom year, a laurel like this can be coated in white flowers, and it might look like it's even snowed on the green leaves. And the same thing can be true with the rhododendron. So a liability, they have to be on warmer sites, but the great benefit is a lot of photosynthesis and the result, a very dramatic bloom during good years. Here we have two hemlocks, both bent over at different times. This tree here was weight bent. I think if you look, you're going to see that its trunk is coming up like this and then bends down. Whenever we get a bend like that, that means that the trunk was bent over by weight. That could have been either from ice and snow loading or another tree falling on it. And then this right here was the lowest living branch to where it was bent over and took off to become the new main trunk. This tree here was not knocked over by weight, it was knocked over by wind. So this was blown over. And this was the lowest living branch that took off to grow up. But you'll notice that the bark on this branch, or now new trunk, is pretty smooth in its bark texture compared to this one. It's also smaller in size. And that's how I can tell these happen in different events. It wasn't the same event, it was different events. Its trunk is actually pointing to something across the road we're going to look at. Across the road is that tree that was more recently blown down, whose trunk is pointing right to this stump here. This is a hemlock stump. This was a stump that was cut in the past. You can see the flat bark right here. But this stump is not dead. It's alive. This is all callus wood that is growing out, trying to heal over a wound that took the whole tree away. So the question is, how can a stump like this that has no foliage to photosynthesize, where's it getting its energy from? Well, the answer is that trees generally growing within 10 to 15 feet of each other root graft underground. And once those grafts are formed, energy, nutrients, even plant information from neighboring trees can be shunted over to a stump like this. So this stump was probably root grafted onto this hemlock, and that has been giving it carbohydrate energy to keep it alive. Only once have I come across a hemlock stump that completely healed over. So now it's a stump that has a completely rounded top. That stump was probably cut over 100 years ago. And this one was cut quite a while ago as well, because generally the callus wood on hemlock, as it grows over, lays down annual growth lines in the bark. And by counting them, you can actually age when a tree like this was cut. I've seen stumps with those annual growth lines are visible up to about 40 to 50 years after a stump was cut. In this case, there are none there. So I'm guessing this tree was cut at least 40 or more years ago. And that would have happened before this became a state park in the 1960s. That would be actually looking more like about 50 to 60 years ago. So again, root grafting, quite common, especially in hemlock, but it can happen between all of our trees. And I've even seen over in Ashfield, Massachusetts, I've seen a hemlock that's root grafted onto a yellow birch. So it can even happen between hardwoods and conifers. As we get further down the trail, we're going to come across some old growth black birch. And I thought I might talk about the bark of black birch because it goes through 4 distinct changes that you can use to roughly age the trees. Black birch starts off as a smooth bark tree that has these horizontal white lines, which are lenticels, and that's for taking in carbon dioxide to do bark photosynthesis. So if I had a penknife and I sort of scraped a little bit of this outer bark back, you'd see it be bright green underneath. Then by about 50 to 60 years, they start developing vertical fissures in their bark. And then by about 80 years or more, those vertical fissures start transitioning into sort of rectangular bark plates that pull away from the tree on one side and sort of bow out. Then by 150 years, the tree has shed almost all those bark plates and you're back to a smooth bark that lacks lenticels. And then as the tree approaches about 200 years, it starts developing bark that has vertical ridges and starts looking more like an oak than a birch. So black birch is one of these trees that you can roughly estimate ages of trees by looking at bark characteristics of those 4 different bark textures. Here we have about a 1 foot diameter black birch, and it's just starting to get some of these vertical fissures I was mentioning. No rectangular bark plates yet, but the vertical fissures are starting to form. So this tree is probably in the range of 50 to 60 years of age, roughly. And soon we'll see a tree that's actually smaller, that's older and has those bark plates that I was mentioning, the rectangular bark plates. So here's another black birch. This one, not even a foot in diameter, probably closer to maybe 8 inches in diameter. And you can start to see these rectangular bark plates that are forming on it. In areas where they've been shed off, the bark is now smooth but without lenticels. Even though this is not a very big tree, I wouldn't doubt this tree is probably closing in on maybe 100 years of age. And the reason that it's small and yet that old is that it's growing amongst a bunch of hemlocks, so it's been probably canopy suppressed. And I can see that actually its top broke off, which would have stunted its growth for a while until side branches budded out and took off again. Often when you're aging trees, you're not looking at size, you're looking at the bark characteristic, which is a much more accurate way of getting a sense of how old a tree is. Here we have a white pine that has a scar that's spiraling up its trunk as you look up. And this scar was generated by a lightning strike. So whenever we get spiraling scars on trees, they're pretty much generated by lightning, which follows the spiral grain in the tree's trunk. And what creates the scar is basically a steam explosion. When a tree gets hit by lightning, its sap instantly goes to steam and creates like a steam explosion that knocks the bark off. Now, all of our trees are genetically programmed to spiral. It's part of what's called their phyllotaxy. So that means is the tree is growing up, because of the spiral, the limbs are being offset as you move up, which means you're not getting limbs right above and below each other. That maximizes solar gain for the tree. Now, the direction of the spiral is genetically determined. And from my counts, about 90% of our trees spiral in this direction. As you're looking up, the spiral is turning to the right. And about 10% go to the left. And this doesn't have anything to do with species. This is all trees. About 90% turn to the right like this one. 10% go to the left. That's genetically determined. Sort of like right-handedness and left-handedness in people. About 90% of people right-handed, about 10% left-handed. So that might be a way to remember that. But the intensity of the spiral is environmentally induced. So if a tree is really growing and elongating quickly, it's sort of like taking a spring and pulling out. The nature of the spiral is reduced. But any tree that doesn't elongate quickly gets a more pronounced spiral. And that can happen from wind stunting on a windy ridgetop, or it can happen by being canopy suppressed. A lot of our open grown pasture trees, once they shed their bark, you can see that spiral in their trunk grain. And then old growth trees often get a spiral like this because they're not elongating anymore. That's a pretty good spiral on this pine, indicating that it's on a tough site where growth was slow. So it's an older tree than you might think. But again, direction of spiral genetically determined, intensity of spiral environmentally determined. Here we have a hemlock that has a lot of scars on it. These scars were made by a pileated woodpecker. They're pretty much going for ants that are in this tree. And a lot of these pileated scars or holes have healed over nicely. Sometimes you'll come to a hemlock where you'll find all the holes have healed over completely and there's no new ones that have been opened up. We often think that the pileate is really damaging the tree by making all these holes, but in those cases, when you see a tree that's completely healed over, the woodpecker helped it by exterminating the ant colony. Now, this one still has an active ant colony. I can look up and I can see holes further up that have not healed over. But again, it's not uncommon to see hemlocks that have been attacked by a pileated but have completely healed over all their wounds. Here we're in about 3/4 of a mile back in from the Kilburn Road trailhead in this chunk of land on the western side of Pisgah State Park that was never open to agriculture. All the holdings, that 6,000 acres, was owned by the Dickinson family that logged in here. That's where they made their income. And they were pretty enlightened because they didn't clear cut stuff. And actually they retained a lot of old growth stands that they just left. But the question becomes, if this was just for logging, why do we have this really well-developed road? This road was actually put in and engineered in a way that's not just a logging road. And actually this road, as we're going to see, post-dates the Dickinsons. They did not build this road. So the question becomes, if no one lived out here, why do we have this really nice road coming in here? And that mystery will unravel a bit down when we get to the end of the road. Now, we have come in about 3/4 of a mile on the Kilburn Road on the western side of Pisgah State Park in southwestern New Hampshire. One of the things that is remarkable about this side of Pisgah State Park, which happens to be the second largest state park in New England, only Baxter in Maine is bigger. But the thing that's remarkable about Pisgah is the western side has a block of about 6,000 acres that was never open for agricultural activity. And that's what makes Pisgah so unique. We have no other regional area that has a chunk of land, a continuous block of about 6,000 acres that has always been in forest. We just don't have anything like that around this area because about 80% of the low elevation forest around here was removed for agriculture back in the 19th century. So this side of Pisgah, quite different from a lot of our forests. We have a lot of old growth pockets in it. This is not an old growth pocket. We just have this one old growth yellow birch here, but we will see an old growth pocket further in. This birch here, if you notice on the side facing me, it has coarse bark that's flaky, but 180 degrees around the tree on the other side, the bark is very smooth. And that's because this is the correct bark characteristic. If you're getting old trees that are leaning, always look at the side leaning towards the ground because it retains the correct bark for the tree's age. That skyward facing portion on the opposite side of the tree captures wet snow, which can freeze and expand and exfoliates the bark, making it look basically like a younger bark than it should be. Now, this tree was tipped from winds out of the west, which would have been from a thunderstorm quite a while ago. I'm guessing, looking at the branches up top and stuff, that this may have happened a century or more ago. And earlier on, I was mentioning about spiraling in trees. I noticed when I was on the other side of the tree, I can see a pretty intense spiral going up from a very old lightning strike. You can't see it on this side because it's over on the back here. But in any case, a nice old yellow birch that as it ages, the bark starts looking a lot more like a sugar maple, where regular yellow birch bark is sort of bronzy colored and has little curly cues of bark, that are exfoliating off. So this is definitely an old specimen, probably a good 300 years or more in age. Here we have a cluster of hemlocks whose bark has been taken off around the base of the trees. If you get in here close, you'll actually see the incisor marks of beavers. This is work that's been done by the beavers. But they're not trying to cut these trees down for food trees. They're just girdling them and killing them. And the question might be, why are they doing this? Well, hemlock makes the densest shade of any of our regional trees, and it's not really a highly preferred tree of beaver. They'll eat young ones, but it's not a tree they really like a lot of our hardwood trees. And if they can kill off the hemlocks that are sort of bordering their ponds, that means when they cut down hardwoods, those trees will more vigorously stump sprout and generate a longer lasting winter food supply. So what the beavers actually are doing here is they're managing the border of their pond to produce conditions that will generate more hardwoods through stump sprouts over the years. I'm sure if I asked a beaver why they're doing this, they'd probably just say, I just don't like hemlock. But in fact, what they're doing is they're doing forest management here to create a longer lasting winter food supply. We're about a mile in now on the Kilburn Road, and pretty soon we're going to cut off here on the Kilburn Loop Trail, which crosses Baker Brook there, across that bridge. But before we do that, we're going to continue down the Kilburn Road just a little bit further to try to clear up the mystery of why the Kilburn Road was made. So this is I guess, the solution to the mystery of Kilburn Road. The road was put in to bring in materials to build prototypes of munitions bunkers. So a lot of rebar coming in, a lot of cement and sand and things like that. And they use this area that's really actually not in Pisgah State Park. It's just off of it into the town forest of Hinsdale. They used this area because it was over a mile from where anyone lived and they wouldn't be disturbing them. But what they did was they would build these double-walled structures, heavily reinforced with rebar, and then they'd put, I guess, a dynamite charge down in the ground and explode it and see what happened to the construction. Now, this one did pretty good damage. It really bowed the walls in, crumpled that wall, which pretty much all that's left is some of the rebar. And the outer wall on this side actually got bowed a bit. So this one obviously not good enough for holding munitions, but they learned a good deal here because then they made another one and tried that. And that you'll see is bigger structure, heavier construction, and that one, as you'll see, did quite well with the bomb blast. So here's the next one that they created. It had thicker walls. The spacing between the double walls was greater. And if you look at this one, you'll see that the external walls held perfectly. There's no damage to them. So I think this said, okay, we can build it this way and it'll contain the blast so that the structure doesn't explode and then create collateral damage. Definitely a unique feature for a book on natural history and ecology, but I thought I had to include it because it's a very unusual cultural historical artifact. Matter of fact, you don't see stuff like this normally when you're walking in the woods, especially in an area that's always been forested. We've crossed Baker Brook over that nice bridge and left Kilburn Road, and now we're on the Hemlock Loop Trail in this very much hemlock stand. And what I want to point out are these understory hemlocks that are only about 4, maybe 5 feet in height. Most conifers have a cone shape to their growth form. If you'll notice these guys, they're very flat topped. And that means they've entered idling mode, which means that there's so little light, they're growing really, really slowly. I would never cut one of these live trees to age it, but whenever I find dead trees that have this growth form, I will cut them, take a section home, sand it down, and with a dissecting microscope count the annual growth rings. And I've gotten trees of this stature that are over 60 years of age. The oldest one I've gotten was about a 6-foot-high one that had a trunk diameter about 1 inch in diameter, and that was 120 years old. So when you see these flat-topped hemlocks, you're looking at trees that are way older than you might think. And they can stay in that state for decades, just hoping that a canopy gap will open up and then they can move up into the canopy. Earlier on, we were looking at a root-grafted hemlock stump, and I mentioned the trees growing within about 10 to 15 feet with each other. Root graft. And once those root grafts form, energy, nutrients, even plant information is going back and forth. Now, another way that trees can be linked are by mycorrhizal fungi. Now, we have 4 groups of fungi. We got decomposing fungi. We've got fungi that makes lichens. That's lichenizing fungi. We've got fungi that's parasitic. And then the 4th group are the mycorrhizae. And these are fungi that interacts with the roots of photosynthetic plants. And that's where they get their energy in the form of sugars from the roots of those plants. But in return, the extensive mycelium of that mycorrhiza in the soil allows plants that associate with them to increase nutrient and water uptake up to 10-fold. And for many of our groups, it's become so necessary they can't make it on their own. And that's true for all of our regional conifers. I know there's mycorrhizae in the soil here because we have hemlock here, and they can't make it on their own. They need mycorrhizae to exist. The same is true with all of our orchids and all the members of the heath family, like blueberries and huckleberries and things like that. Suzanne Simard's work has showed that the largest trees in a forest like this have the most extensive connections to other plants in the forest. It's very likely that these idling hemlock would not be here if they weren't networked into that mycorrhizal network. They're probably not able to make enough energy on their own. But these bigger trees are shunting them energy to keep them alive. And so I remember when I was in college back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, we were taught that trees just compete. Well, there's certainly competition to get up in the canopy for light. But underground, everything is networked together, energy, nutrients, information going back and forth. And so it's a much more complex story than that. There's a lot of cooperation going on here, even between trees of different species. It's really quite remarkable, and we're really in our infancy of understanding the dynamics of this sort of thing. Suzanne Simard's work is only about 25 years old. Before that, we had no idea about the mycorrhizal network and what it was doing, and I'm sure we're going to find other striking outcomes that we don't know about right now. So we're at a trail junction here. Kilburn Loop Trail is going this way, all the way around Kilburn Pond. And then we're going to take the connector trail to the Pisgah Ridge Trail, which will get us back into some old growth coniferous forest and some other pretty interesting sites. Here we're getting close to where the connector trail hooks up with the Pisgah Ridge Trail, and we're starting to get our first outliers of old growth trees. There's an old growth hemlock here. It has a basal scar at its base, which probably dates back to logging before this became a state park. Behind this old growth hemlock, I'm realizing there is a downed American chestnut log that has a very pronounced spiral to it. This is its bottom end behind me here. Its top is going off that direction. So this is one of those 10% of trees that has that spiral that turns to the left as you look up a tree. This chestnut probably died about the time chestnut blight got in here, which probably back around 1915, 1920, something like that. So this log has been dead for about a century. It hasn't been on the ground that long. It probably came down somewhat recently, but it's still persisting. So now we've reached the base of the Pisgah Mountain ridgeline. The ridge is granitic, and we're looking at the granite ledges there. There are scattered old growth hemlock and pine along the western side of this ridgeline. There's one right in front of us, sort of growing out of the ledge itself. And as we get in further, we'll get into a larger constellation of old growth trees. Now we're about 100 meters before we get to the Pisgah Ridge Trail, and we've entered what once was a small pocket of old growth hemlock. There still are some trees intact. A big one up behind me. There's another one over here, a couple over that way. But you'll see that this one here, these two here, got hit by a microburst about 5 or 6 years ago that took down a lot of these older trees, which is too bad because it wasn't a big pocket, but it had a real nice characteristic to it before the microburst came. I guess one of the advantages is that it's allowed the laurel around here to really start to blossom, which it never used to do that much. It was much more shady in here, but I can see laurel across the trail there that's really quite in bloom, and even upslope above me. It might be hard to pick out, but this hemlock up here behind me has this chartreuse green crustose lichen growing on its bark. All the trees that I've cored that have had that lichen on them are over 250 years of age. I don't know the reason. I'm guessing that maybe it takes that long for the tannin to leach out of the bark before that lichen can colonize. But if you're seeing a chartreuse green lichen on hemlock, you're looking at older trees. I did core that individual back around, I guess, 2005. At that point, it's 325 years. So that's probably about a 340-year-old tree now that did manage to survive the microburst. Scattered in this pocket of old-growth hemlock, there are a few old-growth white pines like this individual that can be recognized by the large bark plates that are generally around 3 feet long and a tree that may be as much as 4 feet wide. We're getting really close to the Pisgah Ridge Trail. It's about another 40 feet that way. Back here is that old growth pocket, and you'll see that structurally there's larger trees, more widely spaced. But we're going to pan around in a second. The Pisgah Ridgeline is over here. But you'll see it's ducking down, and all of a sudden right over here, the impacts of the 1938 hurricane become into play, because this is very dense, younger trees that no longer have the protection of the winds coming out of the southeast. The old growth was protected, and this area over here got hammered. So when we hit the Pisgah Ridge Trail, we turned left and came up a small rise, and now we're getting into that area impacted by the 1938 hurricane. We have a black birch over here that was tipped by the hurricane, but it didn't die. 2 of its lower branches took off to become the new upward growing trunks. There's a pine or a hemlock over here that went down and did die, basically with its logs still present. And I can see another conifer that went down up there. And I can see over to my right a lot of tipped hemlocks that are going out at about a 45-degree angle and turning straight up. So the hurricane of 38 was a very impactful storm. The tragedy was that that storm killed about 700 people. The bulk of them washed away within a minute of landfall. My daughter Kelsey is 42 years old right now, but about 30 years ago when I brought her into this site when she was 12, she looked around, she said, "Dad, I think an evil arborist has been here." Because she was looking at all these contorted hemlocks that were all misshapen. And I said, well, I don't know about evil, but yes, there has been an arborist, but the arborist's name is porcupine. So we're in a grove here of hemlock that the porcupine have browsed for probably over a century, generations of them. Hemlock happens to be their most favored browse tree. So they chew off shoots and leaders, then the trees turn and take on different contortions. A lot of dense, usually dead lower branches on these trees. So if porcupines have den sites, which can be hollow trees or boulder caves, near a site that has a lot of hemlock, the hemlock are going to get really deformed like this. And over to my left, we have a lot of boulder caves. And if you come out here in the wintertime, you can see porcupine trails emerging from those caves, their den sites, and then coming over to browse these trees. Here we have an old growth black birch. I was mentioning about aging birch roughly by looking at bark characteristic. Well, this is one that's well over 200 years. It's gotten those vertical ridges. I haven't cored it, but I wouldn't be surprised if this tree turned out to be 300 years or more. There's a number of them scattered in this sort of deformed hemlock grove in amongst the boulders in here. But again, showing that this is a forested area that is still in that 6,000 acre parcel that was never open for agriculture, that still has a lot of old scattered trees in it. Now, To confirm this is a birch, it's hard to do it at this time of year when it's in leaf. But if this was, let's say we're out here in the spring or fall, we could look up in the canopy and see the dangling catkins of the birch, which would help us identify that this is definitely not an oak. Another way to do it is just look on the ground around us here, and there are no oak leaves. But we do have leaves that are from birches all over the place, like these right here. They're all around my feet. And again, no oak leaves, but definitely a birch and a really beautiful old growth specimen. So in the chapter dealing with Pisgah State Park, well, I continue on to take people up to the top of the ridge to see a few more sites. But it is quite a warm day today. We're up in the 90s here. And Ray, who's so kind to be doing all the filming, has a lot of equipment. He has to schlep out and a backpack and stuff. And so I think we're going to call it quits for today. But if you want to see more, you can get the book, and it'll take you to a number of other sites still along this trail system. But this is a nice place to end up. We've got the beautiful granite ledge, moss covered with polypody fern, the old growth black birch, the deformed hemlocks, porcupines who are probably listening to us right now as I speak. A good place to turn around.